everybody. It's Rob again. It's time for another member talk, and this one's exciting. We've got an author with us. We got a friend of ours, a funeral director. His name is Codi Shewan. I got to meet him virtually for the first time at the Cana convention, and I got to, at that time, receive a copy of his book, Everyday Legacy. It's been a great book. I've enjoyed reading it, and we wanted to get Codi on here to talk with us a little bit about why he wrote the book and kind of give us some ideas of what we can expect to read in it. So Codi, how you doing today?
Hey, Rob, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Good to see you again virtually.
Yes. Yeah. Well, one of these days we'll finally meet live.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope that's closer to sooner than further away.
That's it. Well, thanks for coming on, Codi. This is exciting. Like I said, I first saw you. I've actually first heard of you at the Cana convention that was held last year, the virtual Cana convention. Mm-hmm. Part of the package for signing up with that was to receive a little gift basket of things. And inside that was a signed copy of this book, Everyday Legacy. And I really didn't know much about it, but I did attend and I listened to your conversations there at Cana, and it really sparked some interest. I wanted to get you on here to talk a little bit about it and share a little bit of your history. But before we get into that, you're a funeral director. Is that right?
I am indeed a funeral director and embalmer, both. Yeah.
Yes. So that's, very few of us out there that are authors. So tell me your story. Tell me how let's just go all the way back to the beginning. How did you become a funeral director to begin with, and why? Why did you want to do that?
Yeah, I grew up in a really, really small town. Like when I say really small, I mean like really small, like 400 people. We had the big joke is that we had one stop sign that no one ever stopped at. It was a really small bedroom community, and I loved growing up there. There was this real distinct quality of community growing up there. Now the challenge was that I lived in the country and was bused about 30 minutes into the big city to go to school. And so that's where I spent my childhood. I grew up there in rural Ontario. And I always had this, I would say, this curiosity. I used to say this odd curiosity, but I've come to just lean into it because community really existed sort of 30 minutes or at arm's length. There wasn't a huge friend community. There was the adult community, the farming community, et cetera, but there wasn't a lot of kids around. I mean, the closest house tech was like a good hike up the road. Wow. And so most of my friend circle would have been when I got to school. So after school and on the weekends, it didn't really exist unless you had parents that were willing to, take the time to drive you somewhere. And so I didn't have a huge friend circle. And one of the things that I really enjoyed doing was reading the newspaper from a very young age. And I think I was probably before I could even read, I was just modeling my grandfather who, no one touched the newspaper in the house until he had read it. The pages were always crystal clean for him. Yeah. And one of the sections that always interested me was actually the obituary pages. And for me, it was like these characters coming to life. Now, an obituary in the town that I grew up in was not like a death notice. It wasn't like, here's the person that died, here's their visitation, here's their funeral, cemetery, interment, or cremation, and that's it. This was what came in the paper, a month after they had died. And as I like to say, it was a couple of columns that sort of enveloped a lifetime. Talked about who the person was, their familial connections, hobbies, their philanthropic efforts, maybe what they just love to do and their passions. And for me, it almost became this odd little friend circle. And I say it became a little friend circle because if the obituary was really interesting, if that person really came alive in my mind, I would actually cut the obituary out and put it into a sticker book. And I had this like fascination with the lives that people had lived. Now, at the time, it was just something I did. In fact, at one point, for a significant period, it was unbeknownst, in fact, to my mom, because I always took the paper last and then threw it in. Back then, there was no recycling, so back into the garbage. And at one point, my mom stumbled across this album, basically, of people who had died. And I think back now to the the thoughtfulness that she had in that moment, because I think if I was a parent and I found that, I'd probably be pretty worried. Here's my kid cutting out photos and stories about dead people who he doesn't know. And she just knew that I really had this fascination with human connection. I was the kid that would not want to sit at the kids' table. I'd want to sit at the adults' table, not to participate, but to be part of the conversation, to listen. I just really always loved the human dynamic of connection and of relations and community. And so here I had this book, and I think that really started my interest in the death care space. And so it wasn't long after that when I think I was 16 years old, had to decide where I wanted to go in my high school co-op placement. And it was crystal clear to me. It was crystal clear I wanted to work at the funeral home. And again, I didn't know anything about the space of funeral service and cemetery services, but a really good friend of ours happened to own the local mortuary. And so, through connections, we set up that meeting, and he said, absolutely. And he had me come and work. I want to say work in the funeral home, but I actually didn't get to work in the funeral home until I proved my abilities outside the funeral home first, which at the time, I must say, Rob, I hated. I hated the whole idea of, like, you cut the lawn and you weed the gardens and you polish the brass on the doors, and you swing the door from the outside in. You don't ever come inside. That kind of approach. At the time, I just couldn't wait to get in. It was almost like I was polishing the brass on the windows with the Brasso, sort of like peering in, trying to see what was happening. And the funny thing was, at the time I hated it. Now I look back, of course, hindsight's always 2020, but I think how valuable it was to really create an atmosphere where I respected the environment that was on the other side of the doors. And I really held it in a certain regard. And to this day, I'm thankful that the funeral director and owner did that for me. And then eventually I got to swing the door from the inside. And then eventually I got to talk to people and direct them to which room visitation or the funeral was. And eventually I got to hand out memorial service folders, all alongside, vacuuming lines in the carpet and polishing glass and those sort of things. And that was really when it all started. Sort of a long answer to a short question, but I think there's often a curiosity around how funeral directors and cemeterians get into the work of being, in this world. And I think what I often find when even I ask that question is there is no real answer. There's a logistical piece to it, but when you say, well, why, not how, but why did you get into it? And most of them say, I have no idea. It's where I landed. It's where I felt called to be. And that was totally the case for me. Now, I will also say that for those of you who read the book, there is a caveat to that, because the funeral director in town also happened to have one of the biggest houses, owned the nicest cars, lived on the water, had the nicest toys. And in my little 15, 16-year-old mind, I was like, whoa, this guy has everything a little 16-year-old kid wants. And not to mention, the funeral home was about a big block, but a city block or maybe two from town hall, which is where death registrations happened. And again, this was in the local city. This wasn't in the town of 400. This was in the population of 21,000 at the time. But in a job that would have taken him, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes to walk down and register these deaths and then get back to the funeral home, it would often take him 30, 45 minutes, because he would encounter so many people along the way, and he'd have full-on conversations. He'd get to the clerk's desk and have a full-on conversation. And so what seemed like this small task was actually this elongated process where he was like a rock star. He was like, everybody knew him. Everybody wanted to talk to him. And I thought, holy smokes, this is a great world. You got all the nice stuff on this side, and you got a rock star. You're like a rock star in the community. People really turn to you. This is what I want to do. Well, we all know the realities of funeral service, that once I was in and through mortuary school, that very much changes. Most of us don't do it for the money. We do it because we call back to a time when that calling stirred inside of us. And now we're getting to actually fulfill our purpose in this world as, to get to be a part of this incredible profession is really, I think, an honor. And I think that's why a lot of people are long in the tooth for this profession. They come in and they find a way to stay because it really is part of who they are. It becomes part of their DNA. Absolutely.
Well, it's amazing to me listening to your story, because there's so many parallels that I share with you. I too started age 16, working, mowing the grass, I remember one of my biggest, proudest moments that first year was they trusted me to spray paint the lines in the parking lot. And I went out there and I did the best I could. I thought it looked great. And then I looked back at it after it was all said and done. And why would you put, lines down to make sure they're straight when you spray paint them? Just do it by hand. That's the easiest way. Those things were the crookedest lines they were going every which direction. And God bless the funeral director. He came out and looked at it and went, well, okay, it'll eventually wear off and we can do it again the right way.
I love it.
But yeah, no, same kind of story, just, small town and yeah, a lot of similarities. So you got into it kind of the same way. You grew in it. You have been part of this profession now. What would you say? 30 years, 20 years?
No, I'm coming into, well, if you start back from when I was 60, I'm 41 now. I just turned 41 last week. So it's been, the majority of my life I've been involved and around funeral service. And I'm blessed because of not only the profession, but all of the great relationships I've made over the years, a lot of friendships. I'm a lucky guy.
Well, it's kind of like what you were saying about the funeral director there in town. It's amazing the people that you meet and the stories that you come in contact with, the lives that you connect with and grow into families with different people. I was thinking that the other day. I'm at 30 plus years now. Never had any intent of doing this, but here we are 30 years later, over the majority of my life. And I love every minute of it. I really do. I get to meet some of the neatest, greatest people with some of the best stories. I would have never gotten to meet you had we not taken that step this long ago. So I'm excited for it. What happened after that? So you went to mortuary school. Did you come back or did you go on to somewhere else and continue working, or how'd that work out for you?
I would say I slid into third through mortuary school. It was not a great student, admittedly. I'm more of a life experience kind of guy. But I got through, and I got my very first internship at a big funeral home in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And they did about 1,300 calls under one roof a year, roughly about that number. So I showed up on my first Saturday and there were 11 funerals. Oh my. And I learned how to park cars that day. I really had, it was baptism by fire that day. And I had a real eye-opening. It was an incredible experience. I don't think at most times I knew up from down or left from right because it was a dizzying year, but such a great experience. And then towards the end of that experience, I had the unfortunate experience of my mother actually being diagnosed with breast cancer. Oh no. And at the time, I had grown up in that small town, and I already was missing, not the small town, let's just be very clear. As much as I love where I grew up at 18, 19 years old, you're not missing the small town you grew up when you're living in a population now of millions and diversity and culture and all those kind of things that you long for as a kid growing up in a place like that. So I had all that, but I really missed my family. And I was about 4 hours away, drive time from them. And so I turned to the managing director at the time at my internship, and I said, do you know anyone that is geographically closer? I would love to stay, but I would also really like to be closer to home just for right now. And he said, yep, I know who to call and we'll see where it goes. And it just so happened that they had a vacancy that had just opened and they were considering hiring an intern. So, all these synchronicities, these things that just work out. So I packed up my bags. I moved back to what was about 45 minutes from my home, which was way closer, allowed me to be sort of part of that experience that my mom was going through. Thankfully, she survived that and is in remission and has been, great ever since. But awesome. I really was fortunate to be in that experience for the time that I was. And fortunately, again, you talk about coming into people's paths. I came into the path of my mentor, who, we're not as close today because of my departure that I'll get to momentarily from a large organization. But at the time, he was certainly someone that I came to look up to and really respect, who I still look up to and respect today. And he happened to be the regional director of a large corporate funeral group. And at the time, it was publicly traded, still family originated and family at the helm, but publicly traded. And he was responsible for the Eastern region. And he must have seen something in me and my work ethic. And he said, I think we'd like to have you be part of a management training program. Sidebar, we don't have a management training program, but we'd like you to be part of this thing that, we'd like to see created. So we're going to pack you up if you're willing, and we're going to send you around to different stations. We basically want you to collect the best from some of our best and see what you learn. Now, once you get to know me, and those of you who are watching or listening who may already know me, know that I am very, I don't love routine, but I like structure and organization. So going into a program that didn't exist drove me just about crazy. So I started to make a lot of notes, what I was learning, what I wasn't learning, gaps in the learning, just everything that I could write down and turn into what eventually looked kind of like a manual, a playbook. Was what I was doing. And that program was supposed to last, I think the original was 6 months. That turned into a year. That turned into 2 years living out of a suitcase. Basically, wherever I could land, I landed. Some of the funeral homes had apartments and accommodations within. I worked really, really hard for those 2 years to try and improve myself. And at the end, there was a posting for, at the time, 200 call funeral home in, I would say, sort of the north of Toronto. And I applied, and there were 11 other candidates. And at the time I was 22 going on to 23. And everyone else was much longer in the tooth in experience, definitely. And I showed up, and at one point, it happened to be the regional director who had sort of followed my career, was now reassigned and was managing this area. In fact, I think he may have been an early VP at that point. And at one point he asked me a question, and I said, would it be okay if I reference something? And he said, yeah, sure. And I reached down beside me and I pulled out this 4-inch thick binder, and I pushed it across the table to him. And I reached down and I pulled out a duplicate version. And I said, well, if you turn to tab 4, this is some of the things that I've done in that context of the question you asked. I think it was around community development, community involving marketing initiatives. And it was everything I had done in the last 2 years, ideas I had about what worked, what didn't work, what I saw, I even had budgets in there. And admittedly, he had a bit of a mind blown moment. And 2 weeks later, I got the job, and I was the youngest manager ever in the history of the company.
Wow.
And when I started, everyone that worked for me was at least double my age at the time, which was another whole circumstance to try and figure out, because one of them had in fact applied for the job. And anyway, it was the start of my corporate career. And I would also say that, for context, it's also the time when I started to put my pedal to the metal and not stop. And that was, I sort of preconditioned that experience in the 2 years leading up in my work ethic, but now it was time to keep going at the speed I had clearly established for myself, which later became a bit of a problem. So I say that as a bit of foreshadowing to the future. And so I went on to manage that location and improve its, financials and its relationship with the community that it had. It had been not great prior to our team's efforts, went under my direction, and then went on to manage a larger funeral home, and then a larger funeral home, and then eventually an on-site. And then at the time, they had come to me, the senior leadership of the organization, and said, hey, you remember in the interview those manuals you pulled out? That actually looks like a program. And I said, no, it doesn't look like it. It is a program. It's the program that didn't exist for the program I was in. And let's actually, they said, let's turn this into a program. And I said, I'm game. Let's turn this into like a corporate university. And they said, great, do it. You have no budget. And I said, great. This sounds wonderful. And how many people do we want to go through this? I say, we're going to pick 3. We're going to do the same, rotation turnstile approach that we did with you, but with 3 other people who are willing. I said, okay, let's go. And we did that for 2 years. And then, of course, I applied the same principles I'd applied: gather, learn, understand. And then I actually did a presentation to the board of the company. I said, this is a great program. If you fund it, it will make a massive difference in protecting the succession of our business. And it's really smart to do. You're not only engaging the frontline employees, but on top of that, you're creating a succession plan just by virtue of engaging the culture, the people in your organization, and improving the culture. And they said, great, here's a budget, do it. Now, it was a shoestring budget, and it later went on to be a much more fulsome budget. And probably about 4 years into that, I said, okay, time out. I'm running a funeral home with a team, and I'm also running this national program. I think it's time that you probably make a decision around, do I do both? Do you hire someone to do this and I do this, or I do this and they do this, whatever, however it needs to look. But this is not, I can't manage both anymore. Something's going to start to slip. And I also can't continue to go 900 miles an hour here. And so they said, let us think about it. And as it turns out, they created a position. It was the National Director of Training and Development. It was head office based. It was where I saw the greatest impact for me happening, where I could not only deploy this program more with more focus, but I could also look at other ways to create engaging strategies around developing the culture, the front line of the organization. Because at the end of the day, in our funeral homes, the front line oftentimes is everything. It is the face of our business. It's who affects our services. It's who families come to know. And I think sometimes the front line gets missed in terms of how we engage them, how we approach them. And so I thought, if we can create better strategies to do this, not only do we just create a better employee experience, but we, at the end of the day, create a better external experience for our client families. So I was thrilled, Rob, and I spent 8 years doing that. That was the last of my career spent at the corporate level, and it was only at the end of that time that I decided. I actually spoke at a conference in the U.S. I spoke at was back-to-back conferences. One was a snow conference, and one was a sun conference. Not long thereafter. And at the end of those conferences, I had a good number of people come up and say, hey, thanks for presenting. I really enjoyed your content. How do we work together? And at the time I thought, we don't. I'm just here as I'm here as a thought leader. I'm not in love with that term, but most people understand what that means. I'm here to provoke maybe some ideas for you to think about the ROI of training and development, how you really understand that, yes, it's an investment, but it has a massive, massive backspin that benefits the bottom line of your business. And if you consider it, there really is very little downside to really investing in your people. And so I thought, I can't work with you, but thanks, and stay in touch. Well, it was only after the second conference, when the first conference repeated itself, and I had people come up to me again, and I thought, okay, there's something missing here. There's a missing link. Why is no one filling the space? Why is there no one that these funeral home operators can turn into as like a fractional training and development person? A lot of funeral homes maybe can't afford, unless it's a multi rooftop, to have a position that's dedicated not only to HR, but the soft skill side of HR, which is the stuff that I do now in my consultancy. But really the soft skill side to help leaders understand the best engagement strategies to put those people up as a priority in their business, really understand who they are, what their pain points are, get a pulse on that cultural aspect of their business in terms of what the culture of their business is. And so I literally went up to my hotel room and I put pen to paper, and I thought, okay, average training budget, based on what I know, is this much, if this many people, and this. Okay, whoa. There's a missing piece here. And I basically started to put my business plan together at that point. It took me about 8 months to sort of curate the ideas on how it would come together. Probably the last 3 months to grow the kahunas to actually submit my resignation, because I had been there 14 years. I had followed the lead of my mentor, who was now my senior VP, who I had the most respect for. I still have a tremendous amount of respect for him. In fact, I mentioned, the piece of advice that he gave me in the book that resonates as strongly today as it did the day he told me. We're not as connected now, obviously, because I left him there. But we still have a great deal of respect for one another. And that was sort of the start of it all. And here we are today, 7.5 years later. I just celebrated my 7-year anniversary in January. And I must admit that while I miss the people, there's some great people that worked in that organization who are still friends today. I've never looked back. It really has been so fulfilling to see that owners and operators are starting to pay more attention to these sort of aspects of their business. It's not just about the marketing. It's not just about the budgeting, the forecasting. It's not just about their digital assets. Those are all important pieces of the puzzle. But the biggest piece is people. And so when I left and started the consultancy, I essentially said, like, what do we believe in at this consultancy as it's going to grow? One thing came to my mind immediately, and it was people first, always. So in any of the consulting work we do, we have lots of people call us and say, hey, can you talk about our marketing? Can you take a look at our marketing? Can you take a look at our budgeting? Can you take a look at X, Y, or Z? And I would say, absolutely. But first, let's understand who the people are in your organization. Who are the players? What matters to them as team members? Do they care about how they contribute? Do they understand what they're contributing to? What's the why of what you do? Because it's not just serving families. It's often bigger than that. It's being an integrated part of the community. It's upholding those pillars of funeral and cemetery services that are like ages old, like back to furniture building, ambulatory care, those sort of things. That's really ultimately how our business was built, how our profession was established. And I think a lot of operators still lean into those pillars as sort of the stewards of how they operate. But we often get the eye comes off that prize so often because, hey, it's natural. We all have multiple competing priorities. We live now in a more digital age. There's lots of things to distract us, but I often say when we focus on some of those simple things, those often seemingly inconsequential things, they manage to steer us more powerfully than any of the stuff we often think is important.
Sure. Well, it's such a great need that you're filling. Like you mentioned before, we get so tied up with the not asking the question of why, but how. How do we do this? How do we have 11 funerals on a Saturday? How do we do this? The question really becomes, why do we do this? Why should we do 11 funerals on a Saturday? It's not just about saying yes to every family. It's about putting your people forward and saying, this is why we want to serve you as a family that's trusting us to serve you. And I've noticed in funeral homes that I've been a part of or been through or met with, kind of that you can see that in a lot of funeral homes where they're starting to ask that question. Even some of the smaller ones, one or two staff members, some of this are asking that question, why are we doing this? And of course, the simple answer, and the one we hear most of, is we want to serve people. We want to help people.
Yeah.
But why do you want to help people? What is it that's in you that wants to do that? What's important to you? And it sounds to me like what you're doing with your consultancy is digging down deeper than that first initial why question and actually pulling out the real root of the question and saying, this is where we're at. This is why we do what we do. It's not just about serving families. It's about helping us to understand why we're serving the families. And so I think it's great. I really do. And I would highly promote you guys to anybody out there. I think what you're doing is a wonderful thing.
I appreciate that. I think one of the things that I often saw is sort of the crux for why I launched with this sort of principal tenet in our business was, I always considered the corporate groups to be a bit like the Titanic. They take a little bit more to maneuver, more resources. They're a heck of a lot slower to turn and to adapt in many ways, oftentimes, versus, a one or two rooftop where they can make a decision and like it's done the next day. And one of the things that I often saw happen at the corporate level was we would sit around as executives around a boardroom table. We'd have these brilliant ideas. I mean, some of the brains that were around that table to this day are just like, they're just brilliant minds and ideas. But we too often, I would say, Rob, failed to understand how what we were talking about would not only affect, but be administered and be affected by the front line. And so we'd have these great ideas and have these great plans around them, and we would launch them and they would die. They would just completely fail because we had never considered how the people who will deliver it actually will marry to it, whether they will or will not galvanize to this idea, because we never considered their stakeholder opinion. And the front line of our business is an absolute stakeholder. We have to consider them. And so, in a lot of the work that we do, we actually have, very intimate conversations with the people in the business to understand what are their pain points? What do they care about? How does the work matter to them? What in their work matters most to them? And these are really oftentimes simple questions that are often overlooked, I think, because of their simplicity. But like I said earlier, the simplicity of those answers are actually become massively impactful in the business.
Yeah. Well, I want to switch it up on you now briefly and talk with you about your book. I've read the book, enjoyed it, and it really impacted me in a way that I was kind of shocked at, to be honest with you, because we talk about legacy. And I don't want to give too much away in your book. I want people to read it. But we talk about legacy. What's the legacy that we're leaving? And it's, when we talk about that, it's not a physical legacy. It's not tangible things. I mean, sometimes it is, but really, what is it? Who are you that people are talking about you? And I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that idea that you had there, to me, sounds like it comes all the way back to when you were a kid in your small town, of reading those obituaries and saying, these are the legacies that these people are leaving. It's not just I was born, I died, and this is when the services are. This is what I did. This is my legacy. This is who I am. And the book goes into taking that to the next step of, let's live that today. Let's live it today, not let people celebrate it after we're gone. Let's live who we are today, live that legacy, just as the title, Everyday Legacy. Tell me the I know you talk about a couple people in the book that kind of sparked that and kind of showed that living of legacy to you, but tell me a little bit about that. Where did the concept for you come from? I mean, where was it that we want to write a book? I guess the question is how do you get to the point where you say, you know what, I want to write a book?
That's probably similar to my calling in funeral service, where it just happened. No, there's a logistical reason to all of it, and I'll share the one story in the book that I'm happy to share. It doesn't give too much away, but it sets the stage for why the book, sort of the idea around legacy, sparked in my mind. And if you haven't noticed, those who are listening, and probably Rob, you too, I mean, you have got a storyteller on the other end of this podcast right here. So sometimes the stories are long, but
that's great, because that's
I can't help myself. I can't help myself. But yeah, great story. You know, funeral directors, service is happening. Where are we? We're always at the back of the room. We're always just outside. We're in an AV room. Maybe we're basically standing there waiting for our next logistical cue. We're waiting for that. Okay. Pastor, when you say what are we close to the end? Okay, got it. And we listen for that cue, and then we're off to the logistical piece of the puzzle. And so there I was at the back, thousands of funerals before that. And for some reason, the stories that were being told, the eulogies, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I certainly have. And maybe it's, again, that human connection piece, but I get a bit sucked into the story. Like this particular man's story, he was, I would say, grandfatherly in age. I don't know how old he was anymore, but, and probably likely that he was sort of akin to my own grandfather. So I had this like, oh, this guy sounds really great. And the stories people told, just holy smokes. There were belly laughs, from tears from belly laughs. And there were tears from just absolute devastation that this person was physically not in their life anymore. It was just it was a roller coaster of emotions for the people in the room. And I actually felt myself sort of pulled into it. I thought, sure, gosh, this man sounds like he was just incredible. And I had this idea, almost like a lightning bolt, that I thought, I wonder if he knows the difference he made in their lives. Because if he didn't, what a shame.
Sure.
And if he did he live that way intentionally? Did he understand that the decisions he made today eventually would impact tomorrow when he wasn't here, that eventually they would become part of what he was remembered for? And I had this notion that everything I had ever thought about legacy, or I'd ever Googled about legacy, ever been told about legacy, if we think about it in the context of just a singular word, we often attach it to what comes after we're gone. It's something that is there afterwards. And in many cases, it's even tied to like our financial leave behinds. Like what we do is our financial footprint that stays after we leave. So this idea around legacy had this like seismic shift in my life. And I thought, boy, oh boy, if I started to pay attention to how I showed up every single day, I would be more in control of how I was remembered tomorrow. If, like we've all learned, death has no clock, my time should arrive unbeknownst to me. And it really started to really shift the way that I considered legacy. It started to actually steer how I showed up every single day. And, you know, when you're surrounded by death, sometimes you end up with this invincibility. You never really think about yourself in the moment. And at one point, I was about 27 and I had my own cancer scare. And I remember that this idea around legacy, you know, had already been sort of articulated well in my life at this point. I mean, it wasn't long after that funeral happening and the cancer scare. But I remember at the time that it was almost like a magnifying glass, and then it just became that much clearer. That really we don't think about this as funeral directors. We have this immortality thing, this mortal complex, and I mean, most funeral directors would say, "Have you pre-planned your funeral?" Most of them say, "Oh, no." No, but they do it every single day for other people, and they reinstate the value of doing it. But we ourselves don't do it. So, longer story short, you know, I started to sort of embody this idea of legacy. And I had this idea at one point that, you know, this is really not the legacy I leave. This is my everyday legacy. And so I started to sort of live these ideas and then introduce them softly to people and quietly. And then, you know, 15 years passed. And I decided that, you know, now I was a few years out of, I was 5.5, 6 years out of my corporate, I was a corporate refugee. And so I was outside of my corporate experience and I was in my own entrepreneurial journey. And as a speaker, you know, one of the pieces of advice that any speaking bureau will give you, any sort of thing is, well, have a book, write a book. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll write a book and I'll write about people and engagement and culture and, you know, all things that I'm passionate about and that I love. But when I wrote the books, oh man, they sucked. They were terrible. I mean, they just weren't good. They weren't engaging. There weren't any like super great ideas. You know, it was what I did, which was effective, but you know, creating that compelling piece that makes people go, oh, I wasn't landing there. And it's not that my work didn't have that. It's just, I wasn't able to get it onto the pages. And so my very logical left brain thought, well, dummy, of course you don't know how to write a book. That's the reason why you can't get it out. You just don't know how. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll hire a book coach. Well, didn't the very same obstacles present themselves? The book coach was no help. It just did not work. They were not, the ideas were good, but not great, not good enough to put into a book. And I think that she sensed that I was getting frustrated and she was probably frankly getting frustrated. And she said, look, just stop. Tell me in one sentence, 1 or 2 sentences, what you believe, forget business, just in life, what you really believe with all of your conviction to be true. And it was like I reached back like 12 or 15 years and it was like, I believe that we have the definition of legacy all wrong. I think we believe that legacies are something we leave. And I in my own life have realized how powerful it is to shift that idea of leaving a legacy to living it every single day and being in control ultimately of the legacy we will leave, but understanding how impactful that can be while we are still here and how we can deepen and broaden that impact and create a ripple effect of whatever that is, whatever our everyday legacy is in the world. And she said, tell me more. And that's how it started. That is how it started. We had about a 4-hour conversation. And at the end of the conversation, before we hung up, she said, I think we have your book. I think we have, this is what we need to talk about. And the next call was 2 hours and the one after that was 3, and it went on. And it took me about a year to write the book with her help. Obviously I still didn't logistically know how to write a book. So, you know, the structure pieces, those all came together, and then spent about a year publishing. And the book came out last February, of course, a month before a global pandemic. Great timing. Sure. But it turns out that the message was really, really powerful for the times we were in, because a lot of people found themselves with more time to think. You know, when the world around us slowed down, it meant when we had to stop, we spent more time maybe looking at our environment, spending time introspectively and really understanding what's important. I mean, when you're at arm's length from people that you really, really love for extended periods of time, you start to understand the value of that relationship. You start to understand how your showing up in the world impacts others. And at the time, I was admittedly really jarred by this idea that I wasn't actually writing what I felt was a business book. And the more I spent time with it and really fell in love with the book I was writing, and honestly, it's kind of like, for me, I don't have children, so it's kind of like having had a baby. You know, I worked on it on my own for a long time, and then it was like it was out in the world, and everybody got to see it and comment on it and critique it and all those different things. Fortunately, you know, it's been very well received, and the feedback has been incredibly positive across the board. But I remember being quite, you know, a little uneasy about this idea of, you know, not having a business book. And then again, one of those aha moments where I thought, well, hello, dummy, when you launched your consultancy, what was your principal tenet? It was people first, always. So this book is really meant to inspire people to consider their own legacy in their own personal life first and foremost, and then understand how that creates a ripple effect into the lives of others, which includes community, work, all of those different things, and start to understand really the impact that we are making. So while it was a little jagged at first, now it feels like the perfect book to have written based on the feedback and the number of people that say, great in my personal life, it's transformed my leadership. It really makes me conscious of my leadership, which is now a talk that I do around our everyday leadership legacy. And that's, the difference that we make as leaders in our communities. And leaders is not just the person at the top. It's even individuals in an organization and the difference they can make leading things like their community or leading their client-family relationships, leading themselves and their peers. Leadership often gets attached to the top. And I think leadership is really, it's a quality and characteristic we each embody, even if it's self-leadership. So, again, long answer to a short question. Sorry, Rob. That's sort of how the book came to be. And it's just one of those organic stories that just came together, and I couldn't be happier.
Well, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to give away the ending, so to speak, but the thing I got from it was really live your life with intent. No matter what you're doing in your life, live it with intent to leave this legacy, to live your legacy, whether it's in your work environment, whether it's in a faith environment, whether it's in a relationship environment. Live your life with intent. I think one of the things, if you could say something good did come out of the pandemic, I think that, at least for me, one of those things was the idea that you can slow it down and go in and reflect a little bit more on how am I living my life? Am I running from place to place to place, trying to get everything done at once, and maybe succeeding at it or maybe not? Or am I really living and saying, this is why I do what I do? This is why I want to be a part of your life and connect with you. And actually it opened up the idea of relationship building and again, it goes to your people first. Relationship building became the key. And for me personally, I mean, that's really been the way to come out of this pandemic, is to say, I want to build a better relationship with you. I don't want to just skim the surface and we leave it at that level. Let's get deep into this relationship and see what we can do to help each other, because I think that's really what we need. This book talks a lot about that. To me, that's how it came across. And I
love that takeaway.
Yeah, I was really impressed with it. How do we get it? Because I know I was fortunate enough. I was fortunate enough actually to get 2 copies of it from Cana. And don't tell Barbara, because she'll probably want one of the copies back. No, she'll say keep it. I love it. But I was fortunate enough to receive the gift basket. We have 2 copies of the book. This one here, they're both actually signed by you in the book. And I want to give this book away. This book away. So just as a little plug for us, if you subscribe to our YouTube page, or like us on Facebook or whatever, I will send you this copy. So the very first person that does that, I'm going to send this copy to you in the mail, and you will have a signed copy of Everyday Legacy. But for the masses that are going to be upset that they weren't number 1 and got a free copy, how do we get a copy? Where do we find it?
Yeah, fortunately, it's wherever books are sold. So whatever's convenient for people, wherever they buy their books. Amazon tends to be a go-to place for a lot of people for their books now. But if you've got a small little bookstore locally in your community, you can always go to them. They'll always be able to order it in through trade distribution, which is great to support a small business. Funeral service, nice. We like to do that. But otherwise available where books are sold, or you can also find it on the book's website, which is everydaylegacy.com. Now that obviously is direct from me, which means I can sign it, which still feels weird to me, signing books. That's that small town growing up. Why do you want me to sign it? But some people do, and I'm happy to do that and write a message or to someone if it's a gift. So that's the only place that can happen. But otherwise, generally where it's available.
All right. All right. I'm assuming that you're out on the circuit again, talking and or getting back into it at this
Well,
point.
we're getting close. Yeah, where I am in Canada, we've been at sort of one of the epicenters of cases, and so we've actually been on lockdown, Rob, since November of last year.
Oh my goodness!
And when I say lockdown, I mean stay-at-home orders. So
Yeah.
it's been and those lift in not that I'm counting, but like 8 days, 9 days. So fortunate, fortunate to be back into the world. A lot of speaking, obviously, over the last year, and consulting and coaching has all been virtual, which has been fine. But there's nothing like a conference filled, a conference room filled with people on stages, or being, in a funeral home's business with their people. I can tell you that from that perspective, from the consulting perspective, which is different than the book, by the way. That's a different website. If anyone's interested on that side of things, it's Everlearn Associates, EVERLEARN, everlearnassociates.com. That's the consulting side of the business. Yeah. And I can't wait to be in the room, in rooms with humans again. I don't care how big, how small. I'm just excited. Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine. I know that when ours started lifting slowly, we're not completely out of it yet where we're at, but I've talked to a number of speakers that have said, yeah, my suitcase is packed. It's sitting by the front door. As soon as the day one hits, I'm out of here. So,
I haven't had an unpacked toiletry bag in about 20 years. I literally, and I thought when the pandemic started, I almost started unpacking. I thought, nope, we're not going to give up on all hope of future travel. We're just going to keep this toiletry bag. So it's packed and ready to go. I'll tell you, I can have suits packed in no time.
There you go. Do you have engagements lined up for when it does lift? Are you ready to go, or?
Yeah, so I'm back on the circuit. Yeah, officially, my first in-person gig will be in August at OFDA, Ohio Funeral Directors Association. Yeah. They're actually doing a web series right now. We just launched it last month, May, June, and July. There's sort of a 3-part web series that leads into. They're not required, to all be done, but so that's sort of happening in tandem. Cane on the heels, OACFP here in Ontario, which is a very large conference every year. That'll be a hybrid this year, so part in person, part virtual. Again, I'm just happy I'm ready to be back with other people again. And I'm looking forward to a closer to what we knew world. I don't know that it'll ever be back to the same, but I think it'll be nice to be a lot closer to it.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. I know I'm going to end up running into you live one of these days.
Can't wait.
Going to some of the different conferences and stuff. So I'm looking forward to it. And hopefully we can maybe talk about getting you to come to Washington and pay a visit out here one of these days.
I would love that very much.
So, well, Codi Shewan, this has been a real pleasure. Tell me one more time, give me those 2 websites so we can make sure that people know how to reach you. Give us those 2 websites real quick.
Yeah. So everydaylegacy.com for the book, and Everlearn Associates, EVER Associates.com for the consulting and social media. I mean, if you get the book, regardless of whether we ever maybe do some work together for those who are listening, but if you get the book and you love it, even if you don't love it, reach out, connect to me on social media at Codi Shewan, CODISHEWAN. I'd love to hear from you. I love to continue the conversation. That's the important piece.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being a part of this. Thanks for just writing a great book. I mean, this is it. One more time. We've got it right here. It's your copy. First person to subscribe. I've got a signed copy. It will come to you in the mail. Codi signed it. So it comes right from the author. But Codi, again, thank you for being a part of this and helping join the conversation to just get information out to people. We're excited for you. I'm excited to see where this goes. And, hopefully the next time we get a copy of this, it'll say bestseller instead of offered by whoever this was.
You never know. That might be closer than we think.
Yeah.
I love it. Thanks for having me, Rob. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you. Codi Shewan, Everyday Legacy. Bye-bye, Codi.
See you, everybody.